As soon as we begin to follow the most significant events of the Cold War, the Vietnam War will be a separate and an important point. The war, where in indirect or direct participation by large numbers of countries on different sides of political barricades was taken. The Hell Disco in the Jungle. Exactly this name American soldiers and officers gave to the Vietnam War. Despite the huge superiority in weapons and forces, the number of the US military contingent in Vietnam in 1968 was 540,000 people. They failed to defeat the partisans. Even carpet bombing, when American aircrafts dropped 6.7 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, could not drive the Vietnamese into the Ice Age. At the same time, the losses of the United States Army and their cooperators were constantly growing. During the war years, Americans lost 58,000 people in the jungle, 2,300 missing, and over 150,000 wounded, including the fact that American army was one of the best on the planet. Here comes a logical question. How did the Americans lose the war if they did not lose a single battle? How came that they had lost to some peasants armed with the Kalashnikovs? One of the many reasons was the peculiarity of the area, dense jungle, lots of rivers and swamps, as well as badly developed roads that did not allow Americans to use vehicles, fuel and forced them to rely on many helicopters to move their troops. Inside the Vietnamese jungle, deep in the territory, American troops had no other opportunity, but they were forced to move and fight on foot. And exactly, the Americans faced one unexpected and very unpleasant surprise: a large number of Vietnamese traps. Today we will discuss the most cruel enemy of American soldier in the Vietnam jungle. To be exactly, it is the ingenuity of the Vietnamese partisans. Punji sticks were the saddest of the traps ever used. They damaged just 2% of American soldiers and were mainly made of bamboo, sometimes of metal. They were of different lengths and width, and had a simple pointed spike at one end to pierce the victim. Sometimes the sticks were greased with urine, feces or plant poison to cause infection. Sticks were often stuck into hiding pits dug in places through which American troops could pass, so soldiers fell directly there and pierced themselves. The penetration point was usually in the shin area, while the sticks were not mostly intended for murder, but rather for incapacitation of 3 persons at once, the wounded and the other 2 of his transporting soldiers. Sometimes the sticks were set at an angle, and when the soldiers entered the hole, they were unable to tear off their leg without causing further damage. Sometimes the Viet Cong dug pits next to each other, so when a soldier fell and needed help, his colleague was trapped in a neighbor hole. Punji sticks were also used with a barbed wire in tunnels and were sometimes used in preparation for an ambush in places where soldiers could hide and thus falling into a trap. There were also a large punji with a rotating lid. The cover was attached to the bamboo barrel and could rotate freely, returning back to a strict horizontal position. On both sides of the lid was covered with the grass and leaves. Stepping on the platform cover, the victim fell into a deep hole with necks. The cover turned on 180 degrees and the trap was ready for the next victim. In 1980, the Geneva Convention discovered the brutality of such devices and forbade them as weapons. In Vietnam, the Liberation Army often used traps, the main element of which were poisonous snakes. Normally, bamboo pit viper was used. It is also called the 3-step snake, as its poison works immediately. This is a small snake that was hung by the tail at face level. When it bites, the blood coagulation process is disrupted in the body, and red blood cells are also destroyed. Vietnamese soldiers of the Liberation Army hid such snakes wherever it was possible. In bags, boxes, tunnels, in empty bamboo stems. They were also thrown onto the trails where American troops were supposed to pass. As for tunnels, in most cases such snakes were tied with a fishing line to the ceiling of the tunnel. If the American soldier saw the viper, he began to shoot at it, warning of his presence. But if he didn't see it, angry snake quickly attacked with its deadly bite. Another life friend of the Viet Cong became a scorpion. They were also used in tunnels like a simple tripwire. A box with several scorpions was buried in the wall and stretched through the tunnel. If the tunnel rat was inattentive, he opened this box, and in a limited space, the stinging enemy had nothing but to attack the soldier. In general, the Vietnamese tunnels were almost a real masterpiece. It is quite simple to describe them. These are underground fortifications that are perfectly hidden in a local tropical forest. Confusing zigzag chain of underground passages diverges to the sides of the main tunnel with many branches. Some of them are independent shelters, and some unexpectedly break off because of geographical nature of the area. In some places of the tunnel system there are special plugs designed to block the path of the enemy or to stop the penetration of toxic gases. Throughout the dungeon there are well-hidden vent hatches that lead to the surface with a lot of invisible holes. Moreover, some passes at the same time could perfectly be as a fortified shooting points, which was always a big surprise for the enemy, of course. And even this was not enough for the Vietnamese. Tunnels and approaches to them were equipped with a large numbers of cunning death traps and masterfully disguised wolf pits. At the entrances and exits, anti-personnel and anti-tank mines were laid. Often in wartime, entire villages could live in tunnels, and this allowed the Vietnamese to save many lives. Here were located both weapons and food warehouses, smokeless kitchens, hospitals for the wounded as well as residential premises, camping headquarters, shelters for women, the elderly and children. It was not just as a village, but like a whole city underground. Even during the hostilities, the Vietnamese did not forget about culture and education. School classes were organized in large underground rooms. Also, films and theatrical productions were shown there. But for all that, the whole underworld was carefully hidden and disguised, as numerous shelling and bombing did not give the expected result. The Americans eventually had to climb underground themselves. In tunnel rats they recruited low, thin, desperate guys who were ready to climb into the unknown place with only one pistol equipped. Were cramped conditions, darkness, mines, traps, poisonous snakes, scorpions and, if they are lucky, evil partisans. All this was expecting them. Perhaps one of the worst traps that American soldiers faced was a mace. Based on the tension wire when it was triggered, a large metal or wooden ball with spikes fell from the wood. Or the simplest but effective tool of revenge, a lock with rings or fittings that struck a person directly even if he just triggered the mechanism. Smaller than locks, but not less crushing, was a stone with necks, which destroyed everything on its way, including a gated warrior or a simple traveler. Bamboo was a great way to get rid of looters. It was installed in the doors of rural houses. It was enough just opening the door, and a small lock with sharp necks struck directly. Often the traps were set in such a way that the blow was aimed on the head. This led to severe wounds, often with a fatal outcome if the mechanism worked successfully. This is a homemade weapon from the Vietnam War of pressure action, located in a special container made of bamboo. A variety of bullets and sometimes even shells were used here. They were buried in the ground, and when plate that was located above the trap was stepped over, a soldier got a shot in a leg or groin. In this case, the wound was not fatal, but it required serious treatment. This trap was set in places with high grass, as in this case they were difficult to detect. When a soldier attacked a shell under his weight, a bullet or a shell was pushed down the bamboo stem. The ammunition capsule heated up on a thin nail, and a shot was made. This trap was one of the easiest to manufacture and the most difficult to detect. Thus, constantly mining the territory and installing tripwires, the Vietnamese managed to turn the presence of the American army on foreign land into a real hell. The next, not more difficult to manufacture, but not less effective trap was called bucket trap. It was a bucket with necks and often with large fishing hooks dug into the ground and carefully disguised. All the horror of the strap was that the necklaces were rigidly fixed in the bucket at down angle, and after falling into the strap it was impossible to pull out the leg. When trying to pull it out of the bucket, the necklace was only going deeper in the leg. That is why they had to dig a bucket and evacuate the wounded along with the bucket on his leg. As in any other conflict, tripwires were used massively, but the Vietnamese would not be Vietnamese if they had not improved this type of weapon under their own conditions. Tripwire was installed in the ground or next to it. The situation was getting worse by the fact that in the jungle forest at dusk, the trap was hardly seen, and moreover with 40 degrees heat and 100% humidity, which clearly did not contribute to the concentration of soldiers. In this photo you can see a well-hidden tripwire on the basis of Chinese hand grenade. Even with a flash from camera, it's not easy to notice it. Another common option for installing tripwires was underwater. The famous phrase from the Forrest Gump film make us realize that amount of water in the jungle and even in the rice fields was more than enough.
One day, it started raining, and it didn't quit for 4 months.
It was almost impossible to detect such tripwires in cloudy water. Often a vessel of thick bamboo filled with a mixture of ammonium nitrate and diesel fuel was installed under a grenade or other ammunition. This technique increased the striking effect of the grenade explosion strongly. Exactly so, on the 6th of December 1968 in the area of Ho Chi Minh Trail, one of such sites led to the death of Marines and various injuries from the 5th group. Tripwire became the most common trap during the Vietnam War. Naturally, as in any other big conflict, the Vietnamese massively used mines of various types. Ordinary pushing, jumping, tripwires, which were often placed on trails, high explosive mines along roads to destroy vehicles and armored vehicles. An even simpler trap that the tripwire was also invented by the Viet Cong, which was called pineapple. Pineapple, a grenade or another high explosive shells suspended from the tree branch. To make it work, it was necessary to touch the branches, and as the military actions often took place in the jungle, this method was used quite often. We cannot say that the Americans did not fight with all this. Traps and signal systems were carefully and constantly studied. Classes with personnel were regularly held. Pocket instructions for traps and their neutralization were issued. Well-trained sappers took part in the head of the military groups. Americans even began distributing leaflets to the population, where it was said that any trap or bomb reported would be financially praised from the American army. But do not consider that the Americans in this war were poor victims of inhuman traps and sophistications of the Vietnamese. Those weapons that were used against the Viet Cong by the American army cannot be compared with sharp spikes in the ground. In early March 1965, the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign was launched. This was a series of air raids on most important Viet Cong facilities. The operation lasted 3 years and became the largest for the United States since the Second World War. Rolling Thunder had a very sad reputation due to the deliberate destruction of civilians, bombing cities and villages, civilian infrastructure, bridges, railways and roads. American pilots burned rice fields to cause crop failure and hunger especially. According to various researchers, from 50 to 180,000 Vietnamese were killed under the bombs. For example, General Curtis LeMay, one of the biggest supporters of massive bombing, expressed his opinion: "We are going to bomb them back into the Stone Age, and we would shove them back into the Stone Age with air power or naval power, but not with ground forces." The Americans did not spare bombs. Almost 7 million tons of various ammunition were dropped on Vietnam land. High-precision weapons did not exist yet, so there were so-called carpet bombing, which burned dozens of hectares of land. In addition, napalm was widely used. 500,000 tons of sticky purine mixture of gasoline and thickeners were poured over the Vietnamese. Although napalm was supposed for destroying partisans, information that Viet Cong fighters were located in a particular settlement was often not checked. The whole villages were burned together with the inhabitants. Especially must be paid attention to the chemical weapons that were processed by the jungle to identify partisans. The damage was enormous. For example, the defoliant agent orange sprayed over the forest completely destroyed leaves on the trees. The dioxin contained in this substance caused genetic mutations in humans. The consequences of the use of chemical weapons are still obvious in Vietnam. Children are born with serious pathologies. But I think it is worth paying special attention to inhuman weapons in the next video. In particular, the use of napalm cluster, cassette bombs and definitely Agent Orange. All this must be spoken a lot about. If you are interested in the topic, write about it in the comments. Vietnamese fighters had many types of traps. They appeared out of doorways if the door were opened, walked on the trails if you do not notice the tripwire, exploded under their feet. Poisonous creatures like spiders and snakes were waiting in the trap pits of the invaders. Wasp nests were thrown into the parking lots. Mines, grenades, white phosphorus, explosives among the branches triggered if you touch the branch. The earth was particularly burned under the feet of American soldiers, and even underground villages were looking forward to revenge for burnt houses and destroyed families. It is no wonder that Americans left Vietnam losing this war, and it is absolutely clear from where the former American soldiers have so many post-traumatic disorders. Vietnamese syndrome has become a common phrase, and you can understand how difficult it is to live with understanding that of lost friends. Maybe this understanding is late, but still, people who risked their life and were injured in the war from which it has been never learned for what they had been fighting.